This is Art Talk, and I'm Pamela Bond, and today I'm interviewing Sara Dove, who is a paper conservator. That is, she restores works on paper, and she has a rather interesting background. She started out life as a painter, and then she went to the restoration of works on paper, which is quite different, as she will tell us later, on the than the works on canvas. Right. Sara, I noticed that you have that you've had an internship at the Cooper Hewitt Museum. Would you like to tell us about that?
Right. After I completed my master's degree in art conservation, I had a year internship at Yale at the British Arts Center.
Oh, that would have been interesting.
Right.
Yes.
And that was working on the collection at the British Arts Center and across the street at the Yale University Art Gallery. And preceding that, I went to the Cooper Hewitt for 1 year and worked on the collection there.
And then you worked for the Crest Foundation. Well,
basically the work at Yale at the British Arts Center was a Crest fellowship for the year. They funded the year internship as postgraduate work.
And this was restoring all their works on paper from how many years back? How old were the oldest?
Well, the collection at the British Arts Center is all British art. And I didn't, basically that was mainly 19th century works, watercolors, and their collection is strongest in that time period. But they also do the work for the Yale University Art Gallery, which has works ranging from early works to contemporary works. So I guess while I was there I worked on Albrecht Dürer, which would be the earliest sorts of pieces, 15th century woodcuts. And but it's a nice spectrum in their collection. It's a fabulous collection.
It is
a nice range of works too.
Yes, and would give you enormous experience in all fields, or in all types of paper, I should say.
Right. It had a really rich, with a rich collection, you do have that kind of wide range of experience.
Yes. Well, I'm going to ask you later about details of paper restoration and the various enemies of paper and such, but I wanted to establish you first. Okay. I know you are the wife of an artist who works on a canvas and on board, so that you don't do very much, or you don't get very much practice with him.
No, he also does drawings, but the most that I would do for a contemporary artist would be showing an artist how to hinge their works properly or exhibit them properly. An oversized drawing perhaps that would need extra care in exhibiting, but his work is very separate than mine in what the materials that he works with.
But it's a nice combination.
It is, it is. I always say he makes the art and I restore art. And so
yes, but you were a painter originally yourself.
I was. I had a fine art degree, undergraduate degree in, but my focus was printmaking, works doing etchings and engravings and aquatints, so I really had a good knowledge of printing techniques, and I loved paper from early days before I even knew about conservation, so I think...
Yes, you must have, and what an ideal background for what you eventually went into.
Right. The materials, knowing the materials is very important.
Of course it is,
and understanding the artist's intent, what the paper would originally look like, and how paper reacts to different artist mediums is very important knowledge, and knowing how
yes.
something should look and was intended to look by the artist.
Well, if your clients ever let you, will you go back to printing and silkscreen?
I really, I miss it, but I feel that I'm surrounded by art, and it has a very similar outlet for me. I do miss doing prints, and occasionally I will.
Well, they both
work
require
one.
skill, restoration
Right.
and printing.
And I think it's like anything, the more you do it, the better you get at it. And when you're an artist, you really have to focus on being an artist, or when you're a conservator, you have to really focus on that. So.
Yes. Well, I would like to show our audience now the film we took in your studio,
Great.
in which you can explain the various processes, and they can see what a very patient person you are, and what an excellent craftsman.
Thank you. These three works of art on paper are by Dodge McKnight, who was an artist born in Providence in 1860 and died in Cape Cod in 1950. And he's a prolific landscape watercolorist, and was actually friends of Van Gogh, and very interesting character. But they're very lively, fresh watercolors. In the frame, they look like there's no problems lurking, but once they're unframed, I could see I needed to address the problems, which are, two of them are glued to cardboard, and what happens over time is the acid from the wood pulp cardboard migrates into the good quality rag watercolor paper. So the backing board will have to be delaminated from the watercolor so that it will be freed from this, which will eventually cause problems and discolor it. There's slight signs of the discoloration coming through at the moment, and it will really be a preservation issue in preserving them. This is another one that it wasn't glued down. It's free from the sheet. It has old attachment remnants, paper tapes to put it into the window mat, and actually the window mat was glued onto it. So I will have to free this part of the window mat. Also, there is a line here which is called matte burn, which is the poor quality acidic window mat has left a band of discoloration. It's most visible along this edge, and this can be removed so that when it's rematted and framed, you see more of the image area, and it can be opened up, so it won't be, so you'll be able to see nearly to the edge of the sheet and the whole design. This is another one that is also, it's not glued down with an aqueous adhesive, but it instead has been laid down with a heat set tissue, which is often used in frame shops today for flattening posters, or photos are often used with a heat set tissue. And it's the same problem. It's poor quality materials will migrate into the good quality sheet, so that will be mechanically removed, and the acid burn line can be seen along this edge. But the watercolors are very fresh. There's no signs of visible fading. Often when this edge is protected from the window mat, you'll see if it's been exposed to too much light, the colors will fade, especially the blues and the yellows, and often the landscape won't read correctly. But in this case, luckily they haven't been overexposed to light and aren't faded or visibly faded. I really think you would see a color difference here. And so here's another example of a watercolor that's been glued down to cardboard, an acidic sheet. And this is a watercolor in gouache by an American artist, Van Brunt, painted in 1860. And the owner saw visible signs of change and grew alarmed and brought it to me. It has some light specks, which are called foxing, which is a mold, and happens with excessive humidity, and Connecticut is very good for providing that, and changes in the temperature. And when I unframed it, I also saw these, which are an old mat. He worked in the round, and at one time there was presumably a round window mat that was glued to the edges here, and there's remnants of that adhesive. It's darkened over time, and the paper residue is still left. So this also was unfortunately glued to cardboard, which is a very tedious process. It needs to be mechanically removed because the limitations of the design are water sensitive. And the way that it's removed is with a scalpel. Often the layers can be delaminated, maybe with a spatula, but in this case, this cardboard's compressed rather than laminated into sheets. Often the way the cardboards are made, you can delaminate them in an even layer, but in this case, it's a compressed hard cardboard. And when I work on it, I weight the area with, these are lead weights, and I use a scalpel and basically delaminate in small chunks the backing board. And often these old boards, they'll have pieces of glass or little hard compressed papers, so it's not smooth sailing. It's pretty tough often to get the layers off. Once I've excavated, so to speak, down the layers of cardboard, I come to the paper surface. And in this case, I see the paper has discolored. There's the cardboard layers, and then there's an adhesive layer to glue the cardboard onto the watercolor. And I can see on the back the watercolor paper, which was once off-white or white, is now a dark brown color. And that eventually would go through to the front if the backing weren't removed. Also, you see signs of a wood slat where the acidic wood was in direct contact with the backing. So this procedure will take me a solid week of paring down the layers and removing the adhesive layer with a poultice. Once it's removed, the piece will not be lying flat because a little moisture will have to be introduced into it, and it's not lying flat right now. So it will be humidified and flattened between blotters and weight, moderate weight, for a few weeks until it's lying flat. Then it will be hinged with Japanese paper and wheat starch paste onto a rag, a pure rag backing board. Well, this work is executed in watercolor and gouache. This work is an early 18th century portrait done in pastel, which is chalk mixed with pigment and gum tragacanth as the binder. And it's sitting on the surface of the paper rather than a watercolor which goes into the fibers more readily. The pastel is sitting really on top of the paper surface, and this is remarkably fresh and in remarkably good condition for being an unframed piece sitting in a box for many years. The problem is that at some point someone decided to glue it to cardboard, and I'm not quite sure. Usually things are glued to cardboard. Well, it was fashionable for them to be glued to cardboard so they looked very flat in the frame, and I'm sure that's why these all were glued down. But often things are glued down because there's a large tear or there's a problem that they remedied by gluing it to cardboard. In this case, it's clearly a poor quality board. It has a wood pulp discoloration. It's very yellow. And once the this backing removal will be done in a different way. It can't be laid face down as can a watercolor. That's clearly not going to come off. The surface cannot be transferred. The pastel is friable, it's easily transferable, so I'll build a system to rest it on so that I can pare down the backing. Fortunately, this board will delaminate in layers. And once the artwork is freed from the board, I'll address the problem of water stains, which are rather extensive along the lower edge and the top. And that is, instead of a preservation issue, is really a cosmetic treatment. A pastel will be applied lightly with a stump. If water stains are on different objects, they can often be removed, but in this case, cosmetically, they'll just be light retouching will be put on top of, the color will be matched and laid on top to remedy and really to make it just less disfiguring for exhibition. I'd next like to show you a very small piece, which is an oil painting on paper. And the problem is really a structural problem, mechanical problem, that it's cracked and broken. There's large cracks rather than tears, and parts are missing. And I'll take it off of the secondary support, which is another piece of paper, and mend the existing tears, and then there's large holes or losses, and I'll fill those losses with a comparable paper as to the original, toned with oil paint to match the texture, or maybe watercolor with an underlayer of a gesso or something that gives it the texture of an oil painting, to make it as close to the original as I can. And those fills that I'll be making on the comparable paper will be inserted into the losses. And it may be, a sheet of Japanese paper may be attached to the back as an overall support. The next thing I'd like to show you is a document. While I mainly focus on works of art on paper, I often do documents as well. And the problems with documents are usually they've been folded and put into an envelope, and they'll have folds and creases, and those areas become weakened over time with opening and unfolding the document. And when the owner decides to bring it to a framer, they decide they'd like to hang it up and it's lying flat. Sometimes a Scotch tape or another pressure-sensitive tape will have been put onto the back. Well, over time, the tape oxidizes. It turns, the adhesive oozes into the paper fibers and discolors it. In this case, I'll have to mechanically remove the tape from the back of the object and then remove the discoloration with a solvent that dissolves the adhesive from the front onto a blotter below, which will wick out the discoloration. And often a mild bleach will have to be used to take off the hard edge of the discoloration. To reinforce where the fold lines and the creases are, Japanese paper and will be applied with wheat starch paste. And here's another example of the same problem, Scotch tape applied to mend two tears in this watercolor. This is an example of photooxidation where it has been exposed to high levels of illumination, whether it be overhead lights or daylight, and has darkened the paper and made it very brittle. And paper is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture, and it's very susceptible to mold and many problems with just the nature of paper. So I'm mainly dealing with that, the actual support, rather than the design in many cases, worrying about the longevity of the paper. This is a gouache painting on paper done by Jacob Lawrence, who is an important black American artist. And in the 1930s, he was in the WPA and did a number of works. And it's still very prolific to this day. But this piece is done in gouache, which is basically watercolor mixed with white pigment, which gives it a chalky matte appearance rather than a translucent watercolor. There's some usage of watercolor here, some washes, but generally the colors have been mixed with white to make them more opaque. The green in the helmets and the black shape here. And gouache, both gouache and watercolor are bound with gum arabic. And I don't know, for some reason gouache is more susceptible to mold than watercolor is. And you can see, actually it could be tempera, it could be mixed with distemper, such as an animal glue, rather than gum arabic, which is certainly more susceptible to mold. It is in pastels. And this could be the case here, where you see a white fluffy mold on top of the gouache surface. And this will be mechanically removed on the surface without any damage to the paint layer below. It will be just lifted off the surface or extirpated with a soft vinyl eraser. And hopefully that will lift up all of the black. I did a small test and it was successful. This piece was stored rolled up and neglected, and it's not lying flat, and there's some losses along the borders, and this edge there's a loss, and in the upper corner it has staple marks which have rusted. There's rust stains all the way around, but I'm not sure if the artist worked in this technique, if he stapled it to a board to do the work. So they're not really that weak of areas. I might reinforce them with Japanese paper. But the first step is it's also grimy. It has surface dirt along the edges from really neglectful storage, and was basically found rolled up behind a file cabinet. So it's probably in good shape for where it was stored. The mold will be removed, and the losses will be filled in the corners. And then, because of it being rolled, it really won't lie flat without some assistance. So I will surface clean it also to get the grime off, and then I'll humidify it slowly in a humidification chamber, and then dry it between blotters and wait. And at the end of a few weeks, it should lie flat again and can be matted and displayed. I next wanted to show you, since I did spend a lot of time showing you how a lot of works unfortunately become glued to cardboard, that I showed you with a scalpel how I had delaminated the layers of cardboard. And then I wanted to show how once I said when you get down to the paper and you start seeing the paper below, that's the stage I generally go to a poultice to remove the adhesive layer that's next to the artwork. And one way of doing it, there's many ways of doing it, but one way of doing it is to use a methyl cellulose poultice, which is basically pure cellulose in a powder form, which retains water. I mix it up with water, and it becomes just a thick, viscous poultice, which holds water. And I've tested this adhesive. I know it's an aqueous adhesive, and it's starch-based with a simple test, and that it will swell with water, and so I can remove it. So I paint on the methyl cellulose poultice, and then with a spatula remove that final layer of cardboard. This is to minimize any damage with using a scalpel. If you really just want to go to the last layer and then rely on this sort of method to get off the final layer, the paper residue and adhesive. So there's a chemistry saying like dissolves like. An adhesive, taking off of an adhesive doesn't sound like it would work, but it's really just holding water so that the water can swell the adhesive so that it can be lifted off. And here, now I'm just doing it, I just find a little graphite number. Sometimes when you're removing the last layer, you might find an inscription, you might find the artist's signature underneath the cardboard. Here I just found a number 6 in graphite. Graphite's very stable, it's carbon, and it's not affected by water. And so I'm not risking losing any important signatures on the back or any other information. And this is coming off nicely. They don't all come off this easily, but
well, as you can see, there's an enormous amount of expertise as well as patience in the practice that Sara Dove has taken up. Sara, it seems to me that paper has an awful lot of enemies. And of course, there are so many different kinds of papers. How would you advise a watercolor painter, for example, how to choose his paper?
well, any sort of good quality rag paper, watercolors are probably the most conscious of using a good quality paper, and it's a long-standing tradition of using watercolor. There is specific watercolor paper, which is a heavy weight paper to withstand the movement with the addition of water.
Yes.
And generally those papers are of, when I say rag, that means a pure, it was once made with rags, now it's paper pulp, very pure paper pulp, without wood pulp added, such as what newsprint would be. You'd want to avoid papers with a high content of wood pulp, because they discolor over time and become more fragile.
That's because of the acid in them?
The acidity will grow worse, and they basically deteriorate with time. The wood pulp is also susceptible to light change and darkening with overexposure to light.
Yes. Well, then one must be very careful when buying something, for example, at a local fair or at a sidewalk or such, because those people normally don't bother very much with a good quality
paper. If watercolors, again, probably are more aware of that because they need to buy the right paper to do the watercolors on. Somebody maybe doing pastels might be a little less careful in choosing a paper. And I've seen some very poor quality artist papers available today that an artist might choose. So basically, the more expensive the paper, the better quality it generally is when looking at it. A lot of Japanese papers also you might think are very pure and have wood pulp in them. So a reliable art store that knows the content of the paper is a good idea.
Yes. Well, I know there are reliable art stores in New London, and now we are going to show you a little more of New London. This is a public service announcement, and it shows New London.
Okay.
art is a process that fills our lives. See it, enjoy it. This public service announcement is brought to you by the Griffis Art Center, New London, Connecticut.
Well, it's a very nice town you've chosen to live and work in. We were talking about paper, and you mentioned Japanese paper, which has for centuries been made from cloth, I take it.
Actually, fibers of plants.
I see.
Right, and mulberry plants and kozo fibers have been made for, it's the earliest paper making times, and Japanese paper has been used by artists through, other than Asian art, has also been used by Whistler, loved to use Japanese paper to print his etchings and engravings on, his dry point etchings often.
It's beautiful to look at,
it's
just the paper.
Very beautiful,
yes,
and
yes.
lightweight, and it has a very nice quality to it.
Do you buy it in rolls?
It can be bought in roll form and sheet form,
I see.
and there's many varieties of it. It's in rice paper is a misnomer. There is no such thing as rice paper.
I see.
It's really
That's something
made
that you put in the bottom of cookies.
Probably, yeah, right. It's not really true, but people often call Japanese paper rice paper,
Yes,
but
yes.
it's not the right name.
Well, now we want to show our audience the remainder of the film that we took in your studio.
Great.
And I believe you will tell us a little bit more about it on the film.
Okay. Basically the room where I do most of the washing of objects on paper, water washing, and some tools of the trade. I cook wheat starch paste every week, which is used to mend and hinge works of art. And the paste is cooked and comes out looking like this and is sieved. And it's a very pure paste that has stood the test of time. It doesn't discolor or become brittle over time. And these are Japanese brushes, a Japanese pasting out brush to do a lining of Japanese paper onto the back of, let's say, a very brittle paper, and a water brush to smooth it and flatten it before lining. And brushes for just pasting small areas, and in painting to compensate for design loss with watercolors. Also, I have sprayers of water. This is a Japanese dahlia sprayer that gives a very fine mist to relax paper, or during a treatment, this is often used to maybe lightly wash something. And these are scalpel blades, and I mix up different solutions for adjusting the pH of the water solution if I'm going to wash an artwork. And I also humidify and flatten the artwork, like the Jacob Lawrence gouache that needed to be flattened, I would do in this room also. And the final thing I was going to show you in my studio today was the paste that I cook every week. The wheat starch paste is cooked and then sieved through a sieve to make it smooth so that I can hinge an artwork. this is the only paste I use for mending all the tears, lining artworks onto Japanese paper. And before it's framed again, it needs a method of attachment. So I use Japanese paper cut into small tabs and applied with the wheat starch paste, attach it to the artwork and dried overnight so that it can be simply placed onto a backing board and attached with the tabs. And that way you're not using any sort of Scotch tapes or pressure-sensitive tapes that ooze and leave bad marks on your artwork. And it has stood the test of time. There's no problems with it over time. And after the paste is cooked and cooled and it's stored in distilled water, it's sieved through the sieve 6 times to make it a very smooth texture. And the diluted paste is then pasted out onto Japanese paper, which is cut into tabs for hinging. And the long fibers of the Japanese paper don't leave an impression or a mark like a hard edge of a paper tape would. So there's very long fibers on the paper. And that's all I wanted to show you today. Thank you.
Well, now we know how much it takes to work at your profession. It's a very, very demanding one, but it has taught our audience and me a great many things. And one of the things is that the great enemy of paper, then, or watercolors or prints, is the framing.
That's one thing. I hate to put all the blame on the framer because I've focused on that just to make people aware that you don't want to just drop off a valuable artwork at a framer and expect the best treatment of it. And things went in and out of fashion, like gluing things to cardboard was something they did at the earlier, so that it had a very flat appearance, which is out of favor now. And so it's gone through phases. But other enemies are sunlight, overhead light, daylight, and fluorescent light. Any sort of light deteriorates paper with time, so you want to, and also fades watercolor pigments, and so you want to have glazing that protects the artwork, ultraviolet filtering glazing. Biodeterioration, changes in humidity are very damaging to works on paper, so excessive humidity and excessive dryness. An even temperature is the best, a kind of controlled even temperature.
That's pretty hard to get in
That's very hard in
home.
Connecticut,
Yes,
and I think in Connecticut I do see a lot of things that I do see are because of the extremes in temperature, and people living by the sea, that they have mold growing on works, and you just wouldn't come across that in other locations. So
yes,
it's proper framing will help, a sealed frame will help slow that process of
And you don't put
change.
the glass right on the artwork anymore.
No, you need a spacer in between the artwork and the glazing, and because paper's hygroscopic and absorbs moisture, it can stick to the glass, and the moisture can get inside of the frame. So you want to minimize that with proper framing.
Well, you have a partner who frames,
right?
And that must make people feel very safe about bringing their work to you for restoration.
Right.
They know that it will remain well cared for.
Right. After the work is treated, then it will be framed properly so that it can be hung without worry.
Yes. Well, are the different glues harder on the paper? Is one more difficult than damaging than another?
You really want to avoid glues on paper. I spend that time taking the backings off and taking old glues off. The only paste that I use is the wheat starch paste to put the hinges on. And you really don't want things glued down in your frame unless it is the wheat starch paste.
So you're working with the little hinges, you put glue on them perhaps?
Right, we
Yes.
put the wheat starch paste on the little tabs and attach it to the backing board inside of the frame,
I see,
inside of
yes.
the backing board
Yes.
prior to being framed.
And then you put a mat on it or not? Usually.
Some things usually will have a window mat, but sometimes in the 18th century, if someone wants to keep their piece looking historical,
Yes.
they used to just sandwich it, the artwork, the glass, into the frame with no window mat, and if the owner wants to keep the same look, an invisible spacer, invisible, not really, but
Yes.
can be placed inside the frame so it's not noticeable, but it separates the artwork from the glazing.
Yes. And the same, of course, is for important documents.
Right.
But the taking off the Scotch tape must be a terrible task.
It is. It requires solvents and testing all the inks prior to using any of the solvent to make sure that they're safe in the solvent.
Yes.
And sometimes the work can't be done, but it usually can. In some cases, when this tape has really it's called cross-linking, when it becomes that yellow discolored, very stubborn stain, it can be quite difficult and not a fun task, but very rewarding at the end.
At the end, yes.
To have
yes,
it
I should think so.
removed.
Well, the owners must be terribly grateful to you when all this is done.
Yes, they
I suppose
generally are.
it's very expensive. You must charge for your time.
Yes, I have an hourly fee
Yes.
of $60 for treatment time, but I'm happy to look at works to give an estimate, and often I can't give an estimate on the spot because I need to test the inks or test the artist's medium, but I will give a written proposal of how many hours it will take to do the treatment and the cost prior to doing the treatment. Sometimes it requires a few hours treatment time, and sometimes, a week at the most, usually. But that doesn't mean that I can get it back to you in a week. Things take time. You stagger the treatment time.
You have to wait for drying.
You have to wait for drying
waiting.
times,
Yes.
and it usually gets extended for a few months before it's completed.
Yes. I know you also sometimes have to flatten things that have been rolled up.
Right.
You showed us your troughs.
Right, set up for humidifying, and it was a humidification chamber, and then drying it between blotters and weight, and usually that's left for 2 weeks with changing the blotters so that it's flat and the water has been taken out and the moisture so that it will stay flat.
Yes.
But I've seen things that have been humidified and flattened, and then with the changes in Connecticut weather, once again it will assume that light cockling, but that's Connecticut weather for you.
Connecticut weather, yes.
Right.
Well, Connecticut time is also a little difficult, and we have run out of it. This is Pamela Bond for Art Talk, an interview with Sara Dove, paper conservator, and now you know something about it, you might want to know a lot more. I certainly do. Thank you for your time.